my personal behalf and on behalf of Professor Som and Professor Ghosh Maulik, I am welcoming all of you to this course, and I am sure that it can be an enriching experience not just for you, but for all of us who for the first time are conducting this kind of a course. Now, our plan is like this, that in the morning session, the pre-T session, we will be discussing about some overview, not we will not get into the in depth discussion on fluid mechanics, but all of you are teachers. As a teacher, it is important that we give a motivation to our students about learning a course. So, when we say that we are going to introduce fluid mechanics to our students, it is very important for us to let the students know that what can be the motivation. When I was a student, one of my teachers had said that there are two types of students. I mean, please do not take it otherwise, the types of students are fundamentalists and Marxists. So, fundamentalists are the students who are interested about the fundamentals to learn the subject, and Marxists are the students who only want to get good marks in the exam. Now, we can't ignore any such student. I mean, whoever wants to get marks or whoever wants to get a good concept. Of course, nowadays there is a third category of students who are neither interested in marks nor interested in concept. Now, we have to, it is our responsibility to bring all of these types of students in a common platform, and I think there discussing about the motivation for the course plays a big role. So, in this introductory lecture I will try to emphasize on some of the important applications of fluid mechanics which motivate us to learn the subject. Next slide. Now, to get a motivation, I will be showing you some very nice images, and many of these images are taken from a very nice collection called as Multimedia Fluid Mechanics by Cambridge University Press. Now, I mean, what do we know about fluid mechanics when we are very young? I mean, we most of us are fascinated by automobiles. Even a little child will try to play with cars, and automobiles are important from fluid mechanics perspective as well, but of course as children we do not know about that, but we are fascinated. And why it is important is because if we want the automobile or a car to move in a certain way, we need to make sure that the aerodynamic design of the car is perfect, so that there is minimum resistance against the motion of the car. So, there are intricate design issues that go behind these, like it depends on what kind of car we are looking for, like the standard car or the sports cars. Now, when we are talking about the cars, we are also we can also refer to like other transporting vehicles, I mean, which do not move on the land, but they move on water, like watercrafts, the boat, ship and so on, and like these are also designed by taking into account various aspects of the interaction between the water and the craft. Now, if we have watercrafts, I mean beyond watercrafts we can think of like spacecrafts as well, and like here you can see some examples. If you look into this like collage of movies, that the spacecraft being launched or an aircraft taking off and landing. So, if you now see these, you will realize that like there is a very interesting flow that is taking place. Sometimes the flow is visualized because of the emission of gases, and this type of flow visualization is one of the traditional ways in which one can even visualize the flow from a technical perspective. So you can visualize the flow that is taking place in many of these applications. Let us go to the next example. Like very much related to the cars or watercrafts or spacecrafts, you have dynamics of sports balls, where also there is interaction between the fluid and the solid. And all of us know that sports balls have very interesting characteristics in their trajectory. They may spin, they may swing, and I mean swinging of cricket balls or tennis balls is a very important and interesting phenomenon. And of course the players who are playing, they may not be knowing the fluid dynamics behind these, but there is a whole lot of research that goes on in understanding the sports ball dynamics. So I mean it is a subject of specialization altogether. We do not want to discuss upon this in this particular introductory course, but like those of you who are interested in research in this particular area, there is a whole lot of open issues in research. Now next example we talk about is power and process plants. Like when we study engineering, power and process plants are very common elements or common entities, and as we see that like if you can in one of these images you can see the emission from a chimney, and here also you can see that because of the smoke you can visualize the flow. So flow visualization many times is done with additional care, but many times the event itself gives us a guideline of what kind of flow is taking place. So similar things are for process plants. Next. Now when we talk about power plants and process plants, I mean these are man made entities, but if you look into nature, I think the best way to visualize fluid flow is to look into nature. Now when we say nature, nature is made up of animals and plants and of course inanimate objects. So if you think of inanimate objects like river, raindrops, tornadoes, you can see very nice flow patterns, you can visualize very nice flow patterns, and to understand these flow patterns is one of the key motivations that drive us to learn fluid mechanics. Now nature of course also has animals, and like you can see in this example that we can visualize fluid flows, the flows that take place around like for example the wings of butterflies, or a snake as it is moving, or a fish that is moving in the water. And I mean nature has made animals in a beautiful way. So a fish will try to adapt its shape and move in the water in such a way that the resistance, the hydrodynamic resistance against the motion is minimized. So that is what is a God gifted or a nature gifted ability, which does not come automatically with inanimate objects. Now very close to natural sciences we have biological sciences, and fluid mechanics has lots of applications in science of human bodies, or towards understanding the mechanics of human bodies or medical sciences, like the respiratory system, the pulmonary system, the cardiovascular system, swimming of sperms, and in this context I can give you some motivation, some perspective that how complex this can be. Like in fluid mechanics, like all of you are already teachers in fluid mechanics, so you have taught your students about flow of water through pipes. The pipe flow is a very common chapter in fluid mechanics, and we will be covering that chapter in this particular course as well. Now think of a very basic difference between flow of water through pipe and flow of blood through arteries and veins. Now one very common difference that you can easily talk about is the difference in complexity in terms of water as a fluid and blood as a fluid. Blood of course is a very complex fluid, and it is composed of numerous blood cells, and these blood cells control the behavior of the blood. All these things have been well discussed, but there are certain issues which are still very interesting and open ended. Like a very common thing which is known is that unlike the pipe, the blood vessel is flexible, that is well known, but how can you express the flexibility of a blood vessel when you want to study the dynamics of blood through a blood vessel. Now one of the important issues is that the radius of the blood vessel is a function of the local blood pressure. So radius of the blood vessel varies in a very interesting way with local blood pressure, and how it varies with local blood pressure is still a mystery. I mean it is still not fundamentally well understood. So think of a very simple, apparently or elusively simple example of flow of blood through arteries and veins. There also we do not really know how the local radius of the blood vessel varies with the local blood pressure. So like you can see that there are lots of open ended issues on human body, science of human bodies or mechanics of human bodies, where fluid dynamics can play a big role. Now we also look into other examples. I mean of course human body science is very humanitarian, but nuclear explosion may not be that humanitarian, but you can see a large scale picture of nuclear explosion that is going on, the cloud that is forming, and that also gives flow visualization. Of course I mean it is not a design flow visualization, but this is how it actually takes place. Now next example that I talk about is fluid structure interactions. So whenever there is a fluid many times is interacting with the structures. So I can give you one example which is illustrated by this particular video, that this is a very famous collapse of a bridge in Japan, and how this collapse has taken place is because of this following reason, that the wind that is blowing past the bridge is flowing with a certain frequency, and the bridge has its own natural frequency. So when the imposed frequency is same as the natural frequency, then there is something called as resonance, and because of this the structure can oscillate with a very large amplitude, and this can lead to the collapse of the structure. So we can see, I mean these days these kinds of topics are very important in fluid dynamics, where the interaction between fluid and structure is studied. So it is not only an input from the fluid mechanics perspective, but also an input from the structural mechanics perspective that can give the whole idea of how the fluid structure interaction can take place. Now let us come to some common day to day experience with fluid mechanics, like foods and drinks. So you can see that like a can of cold drinks, when it is poured in a glass, or soup when it is stirred, or some jelly that is spread, or the jam that is spread on the bread, and all these are very nice examples. And there are certain types of like entities which it is very difficult to classify whether it is a food or a drink. So, I mean this is a very I mean age old problem in fluid mechanics, that like is it a fluid, is it a solid, or is it something in an as an interface between a fluid and a solid, because there is some classical definition of a fluid. In terms of that, there are many entities which are fluids, but they are not as simple as the commonly experienced fluids like air or water. So, foods and drinks can be very interesting examples where fluid mechanics is encountered. Even something which is not so fluid. So, for the participants who are sitting from a long distance, I mean can you recognize what is this? Is this a fluid flow? I mean if you look into this carefully, I mean we will run it again, this is not a fluid flow by a classical sense, but this is actually a traffic flow in a city. So, if you look into this one, I mean we will try to run it again. If you look into this one, you will realize that like the traffic flow from a distance appears to be like flow of a river with branches and tributaries. So, of course there is a big distinction between the flow of a fluid and flow of a traffic which is artificially induced, but traffic flow again is a very important area of research, and lots of concepts of fluid dynamics are brought into this traffic flow to like control, and that has been used to control the traffic in big cities. And so, we can see that there are whole lots of examples, and some beautiful patterns and many more which are not so traditional. So, many times we want to study fluid dynamics because we can see very interesting flow patterns. In the middle of this view graph you can see that there are rotational structures. We will try to run that again. You can see that there are rotating structures. These rotating structures are dynamically evolving, and these kinds of structures are called as vortices. So, we will see. So, when we are looking into the structure, I mean possibly we are not so bothered about like where from the structure has come, but see how fascinating it is to just visualize. It gives an excellent visual appeal. So, many times we study fluid dynamics with a purpose, many times we do not study fluid dynamics with a purpose, it is just a scientific inquisitiveness and a pleasure of looking into nice fluid flow patterns. So, we can say that fluid mechanics is actually everywhere, like in the living world we cannot escape without encountering fluid mechanics. Now these are some of the examples that I talked about, which are from the traditional applications of fluid mechanics. Now in the remaining part of this introductory lecture, I will try to introduce you with some research issues in fluid mechanics, some modern day applications in fluid mechanics. So, I will go through the first example. The first example is cooling of microchips through fluid flow and phase change. So, the motivation of this application is like this: as we are going into the modern era of electronics, and we have already entered into the modern era of electronics quite a few years back, we are targeting for smaller and smaller sized gadgets. So, the device size is small, but the power rating has not reduced. So, that means the energy dissipation per unit volume has increased drastically. So, because of this energy dissipation, many of the devices get overheated. Now, when these devices get overheated, that needs to be addressed carefully. Now, if that is not addressed carefully, there may be a device failure, and it is not surprising, but it is very interesting to know that many of the electronic devices actually fail not because of the failure in electronic design, but because of failure in thermal design. So, it is important to address these issues, and of course you can say that I mean addressing these issues is trivial, like we can say employ a fan to cool a device. Now, think of the purpose of miniaturization, that you want to make a device small to make it compact. You have such a small device, but you have a big fan to cool a small device. So, your entire purpose of miniaturization is lost. So, you want to make a device, the device will be small, but the device will be good enough to dissipate the heat. So, you require some strategies which fit with the miniaturization, and there you require fluid flow over small scales. So, like fluid flow through micro channels, or sometimes maybe for futuristic applications fluid flow through nano channels. So, how one can achieve this? I can give you one or two examples of how this can be done. You can employ something called as micro heat pipe. So, what is this? That you have a device where there is a liquid, the liquid takes heat from the heated device and gets evaporated. After it gets evaporated, there is a fluid flow because of capillary pressure. We will discuss about how capillary pressure can induce fluid flow in the later part of this introductory lecture, but this capillary pressure can drive the flow, and the fluid flow, when it reaches another place where the location is colder, it gets condensed. So, there is a cyclic evaporation and condensation taking place, and this entire heat is absorbed or released in the form of latent heat, not sensible heat, and therefore, there is no overshoot in the temperature. So, that is one strategy. The other strategy, which is again a futuristic strategy, is you can employ small droplets, and you can take a droplet from a location to a hot spot, and the droplet can take the heat, and the droplet can get evaporated. So, you can use droplet based fluidics to, and you can control the movement of the droplet by a logic. So, it is fluid mechanics interfaced with computer science and automation, so that you can automate the motion of a droplet to move the droplet from one place to another place, so that the droplet sits on the hot spot and allows it for cooling. Okay. We go to next example, like here I talk about one example which is called as biomedical diagnostics. Now, these days I mean we have one evolving branch of engineering which we call as healthcare engineering. Now, healthcare engineering is not a very traditional terminology, but in healthcare there are whole lots of issues which are not really issues of fundamental biology, but are issues of engineering. Now, one classical example is medical diagnostics. Now, traditionally let us say there is a blood testing. So, how the blood testing is done? Like normally patient is suspected for a certain disease, a good amount of blood is taken from the patient, it is taken to a laboratory, and the test is conducted in the laboratory under certain protocols, and the results of the test come, and all this takes time and cost and material and so on. So, many times it is very critical to do a large number of tests very rapidly and come up with a result which can be used for effective treatment of the patient. So, for that there is a technology which is called as lab on a chip. So, what is a lab on a chip is that instead of a laboratory which is the traditional laboratory for pathologists, you can have a small credit card type of a chip on which you can have various operations which are done in a big laboratory miniaturized. Now, the same thing if you do on a CD type of a platform or a compact disc, that is called as lab on a CD. So, you put a droplet of blood and you put certain reactants in small channels which are embedded on the CD, and you spin the CD with a motor. Now, you see where the fluid mechanics is coming into the picture, how the blood will move along different paths on the CD. It depends on various forces which come into play during rotation, centrifugal force, Coriolis force, Euler force, all these forces come into the picture and the blood moves. Now, as the blood moves, there are certain reactants, these reactants embedded in the channel react with the blood, and if there is a matching antigen antibody reaction, there will be a change in color, and based on the change in color it can be very quickly identified that whether the patient has a certain disease or not. So, you require just one drop of blood and you do not require a large number of large amount of consumables or chemicals, and very rapidly this test can be conducted. The patient need not be taken to a healthcare center, and it can be done through a portable device. So, all in all, if this is implemented in practice, this can revolutionize the way in which medical diagnostics is done in most of the places, not just in India, but many other countries. So, you can see the backbone of these devices, the backbone of the functionality of these devices is fluid mechanics. So, let us go to the next example. I mean a similar situation where you are thinking of, like, instead of direct antigen antibody reaction, if you are thinking of handling with DNAs. Now, handling with DNAs is important. I will not go into the details of like what is a DNA and how it is handled, but if you are interested to handle DNA with fluid flow, fluid mechanics is important. I mean the whole motivation behind handling of DNA with fluid flow is like this, that if you are interested to study whether there is a particular disease in a blood sample, then actually the sequence of a DNA carries the signature of a certain disease. So, what you do is you may pass a single stranded DNA through a small channel, and then if that DNA sequence is having a particular organization like A, T, G, C, T, A, G, C, like this, and if its matching sequence is put on the wall of the channel, then there will be a matching reaction and the two single strands will combine into double strand, and that is called as DNA hybridization. Now, if you are, so where does fluid mechanics come into the picture here? That is what is our focus. Our focus of this discussion is not what is DNA. Now, if you allow the DNA to move passively without fluid flow, it will take a whole lot of time, because then DNA will move by diffusion, and all of us know that diffusion is a very slow process. So, to detect a particular disease, it may take years. Now, we do not want to take years to detect a particular disease, so we want to make it fast. So, what we want to do, we want to have active DNA hybridization where we pass fluid flow through the channel, and there can be an interesting interaction between the actuator that is actuating the flow. Here in this view graph we can see that there is a soft polymer material which is called as polypurol, that flap is oscillating, and that is actually trying to target all the DNA which is there in the bulk fluid towards the wall, where the reactant DNAs are located. So, it is a very interesting fluid structure interaction problem, where there is a soft structure which is oscillating, there is a fluid flow, and there is a very interesting interaction between the soft structure and the fluid flow. And the design issue in engineering, always we are interested about the design issue. The design issue is what should be the amplitude of oscillation, what should be the frequency of oscillation, and all these things. So, this can be designed by simulation and careful experiment, and fluid dynamics plays a big role towards that. Now, let us come to the next example. Now, in biological science, as I told that not just in healthcare, but in understanding the biological features or the mechanical features of human bodies, it is very important to understand fluid dynamics. I will give you a perspective of like understanding the dynamics of a biological cell. I give you just one example, like all of us know that there are different stages of cancer progression, and one of the most lethal stages of cancer progression occurs when a cancer cell from its origin moves to a distant location within the human body and creates a new cancerous growth at a different location. So, how it takes place is that the cancer cell moves through the bloodstream and it passes through different blood vessels. Now, there are different blood vessels within the human body, like the large arteries, large veins, small arteries, small veins, arterioles, venules, microcapillaries. I mean, this is the cascading of the dimensions according to the dimension of the blood vessels. The smallest blood vessels are microcapillaries which are of the order of microns, and the cancer cell has to cross this to go to a new location where it can create a new cancerous growth. Now this is known as metastasis, and one of the very important issues in healthcare sciences is, can we stop metastasis? And if we can stop metastasis, a large number of deaths due to cancer can be arrested. So we have to understand that how a cancer cell can pass through different blood vessels during the metastasis condition, and it is very interesting that actually under the stressful condition, because the dimension of the microcapillaries is very small, the cancer cell has to really survive a highly stressful condition as it is getting transported. A normal cell under that circumstances will die, but a cancer cell does not die. So what makes the cancer cell survive in such a stressful environment? Now if that is understood, then there could be some possible physics based mechanism of arresting the metastasis of cancer cells, and that is one of the key issues of research in modern times. So if you, so I will just give you one possible clue to this, or one possible answer to this question, that the cancers, not just the cancer cell but the normal cell also has a cell membrane, and cell membrane has some part which is fluidic and some part which is like a little bit solid type, and the fluidic material is called as lipid and the solid type of material is called as lipid raft. Now in the cancer cell, the dynamics of the lipid raft is such that the cell membrane becomes more fluidic, and because the cell membrane is more fluidic, the cell membrane is more adaptable, it is more malleable because it is more fluidic. So under a stressful condition, the cell membrane of the cancer cell can adapt its shape, can adapt its orientation, configuration in such a way that it can pass through the stressful condition in the blood vessel, in the microcapillary, which the normal cell will not be able to do. So if this fluid dynamics is well understood, then what can be done? There can be some anti-cancer drugs which can slow down the dynamics of this lipid and lipid raft, and that can actually take care of the, like slowing down the metastasis process. And so what we can understand from here is that fluid dynamics of the cell membrane or the interaction of the cell with its surroundings can help us to combat even life threatening diseases like cancer. Let us go to the next example. We have a few such examples, and like coming out of the biological example for the time being, I come to one example where there is a very interesting actuation of flow. In fluid mechanics, like if we, any one of us is asked about like how do you drive a flow, most of us say that we have a pump, by a pump we drive a flow, and it is very common, it is not a wrong answer, and it is a very common household example of how to actuate a flow, how to drive a flow, not just household example but also examples in industries. But in small scales, when you talk about actuation of fluid flow, sometimes it is very cumbersome to employ a pump which has moving components and wear and tear and friction and which can occupy a large space. Here I show by an example of how to actuate a flow by using light. So it is a very fascinating example. Let us say if you look into this diagram where the mouse pointer is pointing, if you see that this is a T-shaped channel, this is a micro channel, a channel of micrometer dimensions, and the whole idea is that when the liquid, which is shown by orange color here, when the liquid goes to the junction, we will make a logical switch by fluid mechanics. So based on our decision, the liquid will either move towards the right or move towards the left. Now what we do for that is actually we coat the top inner surface of the upper channel with a metal oxide semiconductor, say titanium dioxide, zinc oxide, which have energy gap compatible with the energy supplied by ultraviolet light. And what we do, what we basically do is we shine ultraviolet light, let us say we want to move this towards the right. So what we do, we shine ultraviolet light on the channel, on the inner side of the channel. So what if we shine ultraviolet light, and if the material is titanium coated with titanium dioxide or zinc oxide, so immediately electron hole reaction start. So when electron hole reaction start, then the surface will have either excess electrons or it will have excess holes. So in this case the surface will become negatively charged, it will have excess electrons, and that what it will make sure is that the surface energy state has changed. So because of the surface energy state has changed, there will be a change in the wettability of the surface. So a surface which was earlier hydrophobic, hydrophobic means a surface which has phobia for water, does not like water. So it will become now hydrophilic, it will now like water. So water by magic as if will turn towards the right. Now you can pattern it in a certain way, you can switch, if you switch off the light this effect will vanish. You can pattern the surface with the material, the zinc oxide or titanium dioxide, and in this way you can pattern fluid flow. So you can combine the flow, you can combine a control of flow over time and flow over space, and this is a non-intrusive way of controlling the flow. So this example I call it a multi-physics example. So fluid mechanics, so these days the study of a subject is not just unidirectional, we have to understand that like physics of various areas, physics, chemistry of various topics, they combine and synthesize together to develop a practical application. So here it is not just fluid mechanics, but device physics, physics of semiconductors, all these come into the picture to design a practical device, and fluid dynamics plays a big role. It is the surface tension force that plays a big role towards controlling the functionalities of these devices. Now come to the next example, we have a couple of more examples before we will wind up this introductory lecture, and again another example from the healthcare sector, but this example is with a different motivation. Now let us consider like the management of diabetes. Now diabetes is a very common disease in Asia and typically in India, and not just in Asia and India but worldwide. Now there are several diabetes patients whose blood samples need to be tested regularly to test the amount of sugar, and then based on the amount of sugar there has to be an insulin delivery. I mean many patients have to take insulin. Now many times what is done is that routine blood tests are taken which are done which are not comfortable to do on a daily basis, and routine injections of insulin have to be given which are also not comfortable. So to take care of that, I mean this is one particular design which was done in collaboration with an Indian group and a Japanese group, and the design of the system is like this, that instead of a traditional needle you have a micro needle. So if you have a micro needle, now how the micro needle will function? Now this is an example which I typically want to highlight. This is called as biomimetics. When this micro needle was designed, it was designed to work in a certain way as a female mosquito sucks blood from a animal or a human being. So there are several intricate mechanisms, I will not go into the details of the mechanisms of how a mosquito sucks blood, but the whole idea is that when a mosquito sucks blood, its head moves like a hammer and it creates a suction pressure, and because of the suction pressure the blood is taken into the labium of the mosquito, and then because of surface tension the blood is transported through the labium with very little indentation force. So, many of you can argue that yes, but we do not think it is a painless process, because when a mosquito sucks blood we feel some irritation, but this irritation is not because of any mechanical perturbation, it is because of a chemical irritant that the mosquito spreads after biting. So, we want to take the example of the functionality of the mosquito's blood sampling mechanism and convert that into a wristwatch type of a device, where there will be small micro needles. I mean, incidentally the mosquito's labium is of the order of microns. So, the dimension of the diameter of the labium of the mosquito is like 30 micron, 40 micron, like that. So, if you make micro needles of that dimension, and then if you are having that in the back case of a wristwatch type of device, then and if you have an actuation mechanism where a suction pressure is created, then a small droplet of blood will be taken, and then it will go to a blood glucose sensor which is embedded within the wristwatch type of a device, and instantaneously the level of the blood glucose will be tested, and based on that a smart insulin delivery system will deliver insulin through the some of the needles which are located in the back case of the wristwatch. So, it is a painless, apparently painless device, because it of course because of its action it creates a suction pressure, and then surface tension is the force which takes magically the blood from one end of the needle to the other. So, that is the science behind it, but there is also a psychology behind the device. So, instead of somebody attacking you with an injection syringe for sucking blood or delivering insulin, it is a device, it is a wristwatch, handhold wristwatch device, where you just press a button and the whole operation takes place. So, you can understand that like again fluid mechanics can be a backbone of the design of this device, because you have to design the micro needle properly to make the surface tension work. If you make it a traditional needle, surface tension cannot be so important over larger scales. Like if you make a needle of millimeter or centimeter dimensions, surface tension will not work so well, but if you make a micro needle, surface tension will work beautifully, and therefore surface tension is a very important component of physics of fluid flow over small scales, and we will discuss about that in one of the subsequent lectures. Now, let us come to like a sort of conclusion that we can draw from understanding fluid mechanics. Now, fluid mechanics is something like we have seen many fascinating examples, but there are not just because of these fascinating examples, there are additional motivations that like trigger our interest of studying fluid mechanics. Fluid mechanics is often amazing, many times it contradicts common intuition. Like this is where I want to highlight that what should be the correct spirit of learning science. All of us are born with certain intuitions, like even my little son knows that if he puts his finger in fire it will burn. So, he will not usually put finger in fire. This is what is common human intuition, and most of the times it is correct, but you have to understand that there are certain events which occur in life which do not in scientific life which do not follow intuition, and if we now break our head to understand that why it is not following intuition and get the reason, the logic behind that, to me that is the correct way of learning science. So, fluid mechanics is often amazing because many times it contradicts common intuitions. I will talk about some important features, and without going into these in details because of lack of time, but certain issues. Rough surfaces may reduce frictional resistance against fluid flow instead of acting as hindrances. Without friction, birds cannot fly and fish cannot swim. Symmetric problems may have asymmetric solutions. Presence of particles in a flow may reduce effective viscous nature of the fluid. A highly viscous flow may be a good simulator of ideal flows with zero viscosity. Time dependence of a flow depends on the choice of the reference frame from which you are looking into the flow. Shear force may vanish although shear stress may exist. So, these are all very non-intuitive statements, but fluid mechanics, study of fluid mechanics reveals that these statements are indeed valid statements, these are not just fictitious statements. Because of lack of time we will not go into the details of all these statements, but maybe I will come to one example to demonstrate that rough surfaces may reduce frictional resistances against fluid flow instead of acting as hindrances. So, we call this as the rough makes it smooth. How is it possible? Now, if you have a channel which is made of a rough and hydrophobic material. So, rough and hydrophobic material, what it can do, actually it can give a very fascinating, give rise to a very fascinating sequence of events that can give rise to formation of nanoscale bubbles, bubbles which are of nanometer size. These bubbles, if you look into this surface, this is a highly rough surface and small bubbles of nanometer size can sit on this surface. So, when liquid is flowing on the top of this rough surface, the liquid is not actually encountering the roughness of the surface directly. So, the bubbles are acting like cushioning blankets. So, they are shielding the bulk liquid from the exposure to the rough surface, and that can make the flow effectively frictionless or with very little friction. So, we can say now how these bubbles were created. One of the issues or one of the features is the hydrophobicity of the material, but the other important issue is the roughness of the material. So, the roughness and hydrophobicity combination can give rise to the formation of these nanoscale bubbles. So, we can give it a name that the rough makes it smooth. It is a non-intuitive phenomenon because we expect that rougher the channel actually it will inhibit the flow more, but in this example we can see that under certain control conditions, if we can give rise to the formation of these nanoscale bubbles which are adhering to the surface not blocking the flow, then it can actually enhance the flow instead of creating a resistance. So, to summarize, I would say that we have a broad perspective of studying fluid mechanics. Now, to study fluid mechanics we have to understand that there are certain features which come through experiments, like for example understanding the correct boundary condition, what is happening at the boundary. To understand that better we have to do experiments, but many times doing a large number of experiments is very difficult and very costly and time consuming, and it is very difficult to get all detailed parameters from experiments. So, we have to do a theoretical study of fluid mechanics, and if the equations are very complicated we have to simulate the equations through computer, and that is what is computational fluid dynamics all about. So, we have experimental fluid dynamics and theoretical fluid dynamics which is assisted with computational fluid dynamics, and this combination together gives rise to the understanding, not just understanding science but also solving many practical problems which can give rise to societal benefits. So, that is what is a broad perspective of fluid mechanics that we have to keep in mind, and I think this kind of motivation should be there before we move on to the in-depth lectures and concepts of fluid mechanics. I would like to acknowledge some of the videos that we have demonstrated in this particular lecture, and as I have already mentioned, these videos are taken from Multimedia Fluid Dynamics, which is a collection of fluid dynamics videos and published by the Cambridge University Press. Okay, thank you very much. I think we will take a short break and then we will go to our next chapter.